Allison.
Good morning, afternoon, evening to everybody, depending on what time zone you're in. It's just after midnight for me, so I'm going to hope that my baby doesn't wake up and interfere, but if he does, he does. So I just want to start the session very quickly by thanking everyone for coming to listen to the speakers, as well as to the speakers themselves for their hard work in presenting their research. So this symposium was born basically when I started to sort of look at across animals at responses to hurricanes, and I found there was not that much research that looked at the response of wildlife in particular to hurricanes, and even fewer bits of research that looked at these things in the same place. So we're able to compare different animals at the same time and look at differences and similarities in response. Which is what we're going to try and do today. So each of the speakers today is talking about a different mammal population, and I'm hoping that the Q&A at the end and the discussion will sort of start to find some thematic responses that will allow us to better understand hurricane response. So very quickly, I will just introduce the speakers so that we don't eat too much time up into the discussion at the end. So the first speaker will be myself. So I'm Alison Behe from the Australian National University. And my talk is entitled Long-Term Monitoring of a Primate Population Following a Major Hurricane. We then have Armando Donce from the Nicaragua Tapir Project, which is based at the University of the Autonomous Regions of the Nicaraguan Caribbean Coast. Armando also has affiliations at the Global Wildlife Conservation, as well as at the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife in the United States. We have Dr. Aaron Shields, who is a research biologist and rodents project leader at the National Wildlife Research Center, and he's going to be giving a talk about invasive mammal responses to experimental and natural hurricane effects in wet and dryland tropical forests of Caribbean islands. And our final speaker is Lucille Vera from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, who's going to be talking about the effects of a major hurricane on bat species diversity and functional groups in a gradient anthropic disturbance. Before I turn over to the ATBC assistants to play the video, just a little bit of housekeeping. So once the video plays, all of the talks will play in succession. They're about 10 minutes each. During this time, we'll have no cameras going, so mics will be turned off, video will be turned off, and we ask that any questions coming in from the audience be done using the Q&A function. That'll be at the bottom of your screen, so you can type in your questions as you think of them during the talks. And then at the end, when we do the Q&A and myself as moderator, I'll pick out some questions that we'll try and address as many of the questions as we can, but I'll sort of be the chair of that to ask those questions to the speakers. And anything we don't get to, feel free, please, to use the meeting app to contact speakers to ask questions individually and carry the discussion on. So I think that's all the housekeeping. So again, a big welcome to our speakers and a big thank you for being part of this session. And I will now hand over to start the video. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming today to listen to my talk that will explore long-term monitoring of a primate population post-hurricane. So a seminal paper in 2017 by Alejandro Estrada and many others documented the fact that 60% of primate species across all 16 families are currently threatened, and 75% of these are in decline, and that's across every region that primates are found. This is largely due to deforestation that has led to a decrease in 58% in subtropical forests and 46% in subtropical forests across primate ranges. Now, this has resulted in the majority of primates now living in isolated forest fragments. And it's well documented that within these fragments, primates are faced with lower food quality, with reduced dispersal options, and as a result, less genetic diversity. Now, when we couple this fact that primates are already living in fairly degraded habitats with the fact that it's been projected that there will be an increase in both the frequency and intensity of natural disasters in primate areas, particularly hurricanes and cyclones in coming years, we can see that primates are going to be in double jeopardy of facing extinction into the future. So understanding the impacts of natural disasters are really important for us to gauge just how they will be impacting, just how we can better conserve these important species. Now, over the last 2 decades, there have been a lot of short-term studies that have looked at the impact of these natural disasters, particularly cyclones and hurricanes, on non-human primate populations. And these have shown that sort of in the first couple of years after the storm, we often see a decline in population size. We see changes in diet and activity in response to the changing structure of the forest post-hurricane. And we see changes in reproduction, often with a decrease in birth rates. Although this one's interesting because it's a bit more variable in lemur species that are more adapted to that real stochastic environment. Now, some of the previous work that I have done was on Hurricane Iris. It was one of the first studies to document the impact of a hurricane for which pre-hurricane data existed. So Hurricane Iris was a Category 4 hurricane that made landfall in October 2001. When we looked at the damage of the storm, we assessed that 35% of food trees and 52% of fruit trees suffered mortality during the storm, and that there was a 78% decline in population size in the first 18 months after the storm, at which point population sort of stayed there and then gradually began to increase. And what our study showed was that this gradual increase in population size was tied to fruit production. So this species that was thought to be this real generalist folivore that could sort of survive in any habitat and do really well actually needed fruit in its diet in order to be able to sustain itself long term. So these short-term studies have been really, really valuable in getting us information on what sort of behavioral strategies are used to allow animals to be resilient after storms. And that's really helped us to better understand population dynamics and natural disasters. However, there are very few studies that look at this over the long term. So what the goal of this research is to increase this presentation rather, is to increase our understanding of how populations fare in the long term by reviewing population size, group size, and birth data from 17 years after Hurricane Iris. And at the same time, to analyze ecological data, to look at how the forest has changed and how these two things then might be tied together so we can get a better sense of how populations are returning to normal or returning to surviving and thriving in their post-hurricane environment. So in order to do this, we needed demographic and ecological data. So the demographic data was collected through surveys of the Monkey River area. So pre-hurricane data was collected twice per year before the hurricane, and actually we had people on site the day before the hurricane. So we had a really accurate post-hurricane count of population and group size, as well as number of infants. And then after the hurricane, it was collected twice per month between 2002 and 2007 when we had researchers on site all of the time, and then twice per year every year after that up until 2018. For ecological data, we collected 20 meter by 20 meter ecological plots once a year, and once a year we collected 32 of these plots across the home range of the 4 groups that had been the regular study groups. So what we found was that population density and group size sort of followed the same sort of trajectory. So I already explained how sort of that immediate response where we saw a drastic decline of 78% in the first 18 months, and then that gradual increase. But what we saw after that was from 2007, we saw a relatively rapid increase to about 80 animals per individual squared, which is 20% smaller than post-hurricane size, where it has stayed ever since. So the population has stabilized at a larger size, but it's not as big as it was before the hurricane. And group size has pretty much done the same thing, which might not be surprising. But what we see now is actually a higher group size than we had before the hurricane. So we seem to have less groups that are bigger in size, which could be a response to a changing food supply. So similar to this, we also have changes in birth rate. So there were no babies born in the year following the storm. And then we very rapidly had an increase to what was the pre-hurricane birth rate of 0.4 babies per female. And then this has followed sort of some dips and some increases, but we did see the maximum birth rate occurring in 2007, 2009, which we're not totally sure why. And then this just sort of went up and down. So this was much more erratic, which could be due to a variety of factors, including food supply, including changes in predation, which is something we didn't measure, as well as infanticide, which we do know occurs in this species, and we have witnessed it once at the site, but it's a rare event and we cannot always obviously catch it. So what does this mean in the context of the ecology of the site? Well, we did collect data every year, but for ease of presentation here, I've got pre-hurricane results and then every 5 years after that. So these species were chosen because they were the most important food species in the diet of the monkeys before the hurricane. So they were the species that were eaten for the majority of time. And what we see when we look at the pre-hurricane and post-hurricane densities is that 2007 spike in population size actually ties to when we start to see an increase in 2 species in particular, Pterocarpus officinalis and Indira annumis. And when we look at the nutritional information of these species, which was published in Behe and Pavelka 2012, Pterocarpus officinalis has mature leaves and young leaves that are very high in protein, the second highest of all the leaves that we tested, as well as relatively high in sugar. Now, in Dira nermis, the monkeys eat the flowers, and these flowers had the highest sugar content of any of the flowers that the monkeys ate. Now, what's interesting is that we already said that the population recovery initially was tied to fruit, and that's because we think that without a certain amount of sugar in their diet, the animals are in sort of in energy imbalance, and they can't thrive and reproduce and grow as well. So this could be a response to, let's say, this decline in ficus species. So figs were very important in the diet of the animals before the hurricane, but they really dropped off. They had a very high mortality rate, and that stayed very low, so they didn't recover in the same way as the other trees. So we see a much lower density of figs, an asynchronous fruiting tree, which would have been a really important source of sugar in the pre-hurricane diet. So I'm wondering if the increase in these two species in particular are very high in sugar might have had something to do with this spike in population after 2007. The other interesting thing to note is that Cecropia peltata is a fast-growing pioneer species. It proved to be very important in the diet immediately following the hurricane, with mature leaves that were very low in fiber, high in protein, high in sugar. Those species started to drop off after sort of 2007. So again, this could be a response to that. So we're seeing these interesting demographic patterns that might in fact be mirroring changes in the nutritional profile of the available trees in the forest. So what this is showing us is that while the change in population size and the overall reduction in population size very well be due to things that we didn't measure, like as I said, changes in predation rate, there seems to be some tie to the ecological profile of the forest, and particularly to the nutritional, nutrients that are available to the animals. And so this monitoring post-hurricane in the long term of not only the trees that are there, but of the nutritional profile of what the animals are eating could prove really important in terms of our understanding of how populations survive in some areas better than others, and how we may be better able to introduce things like forest regeneration programs with the right sorts of trees providing the right sorts of nutrients. So thank you very much for listening. We would like to acknowledge all of the research assistants that have helped over the years, as well as all of our funding bodies. Thanks for listening.
Hello, I'm Aaron Shields. I'm with USDA's National Wildlife Research Center in Fort Collins, Colorado, where I'm a rodent research scientist. Pictured here are my two co-authors, and I'm speaking about invasive mammal responses to hurricanes today. Hurricanes are these large windstorm events that affect many places on the planet. The area that I'm going to speak to you about today is the Caribbean, which is shown with the yellow dot. Hurricane frequency is on the rise. Some have said that we're in an uptick of a long-term natural cycle, but more and more evidence is actually pointing to the increased hurricane frequency due to global climate change. The research question that we're really interested here today is, how do hurricanes affect invasive mammals? And this is a picture, a map of the Caribbean, where the 4 islands that I'm going to discuss are shown. In pink are the islands that have invasive mongoose. Ironically, today I'm going to speak very little about invasive mongoose and really focus on invasive rodents. And for the islands that I'm going to speak to you about, I'm asking the 2 research questions at the bottom there. The first is there evidence that new islands become invaded following these large hurricane events? And secondly, how do invasive mammal populations change after these severe hurricanes? So the first island that I'm going to talk to you about to answer the first question is called Green Cay, and it's just about 450 meters off of the main island of St. Croix. On this island, we indeed detected rats after the hurricane. There were no rats before, and there were rats that were detected after. How did we determine that? Well, we used tracking tunnels, which are these baited ink cards placed inside of a tunnel, and the bait lures in animal, and the ink leaves footprints, and you can identify those footprints to species. So prior to the hurricane, we had a rat-free island for several years, and following the hurricane, we had evidence that rats had established. This was 9 months after the hurricane that they had established. We believe the rats had established by rafting on hurricane debris or possibly swimming, or the combination of those two. Now this is important because the native and endangered ground lizard pictured there, it cannot survive with the rat on the island. So the main point here is that islands indeed may be colonized by invasive animals following these storms, and that has quite severe consequences for some of these native animal or native species. The second question, to answer the second question, I'm going to show you examples from 3 different islands. The first is the southwest part of the main island of St. Croix, Sandy Point National Wildlife Refuge. And this area, Sandy Point, is one of the most dense sea turtle nesting areas in the Caribbean. And the main threats for sea turtles are invasive mammals, including rats, mongoose, and cat. So again, using tracking tunnels outlined in yellow on the map there, we had pre and post hurricane sampling. This was pre and post the category 3 to 5 hurricanes, Irma and Maria. And you can see that the main effects here are the house mouse explosion that occurred after the hurricane. It over doubled in size of abundance. The rat and mongoose populations, interestingly, actually declined after the hurricane. They slightly declined, and the cat is shown there, but these tracking tunnels just are not really set up to sample cats very well. The next island is Buck Island, which is also off of the island of St. Croix, the northeast corner. This is a dry forest, and rats had been eradicated in the year 2000. The ground lizard, the endangered ground lizard that I showed you before, is also on this island. And so once rats were removed, the ground lizard could be reintroduced. And every year since the rat eradication, the land managers have been sampling annually out of surveillance to ensure that rats were absent and continue to be absent on the island. They knew that there were house mice on the island, and that's what we're showing in the graph here, is that the number of house mice about doubled after Hurricane Irma and Maria. And not only that, but the land managers have documented that the opening of this dry forest, they noticed that there was an increase in the abundance or the cover of grass, and we think that that might also be partially driving the house mouse explosion following these hurricane events. The last island that I'm going to speak to you about today is the island of Puerto Rico. In the northeast corner is the El Yunque National Forest. This is a long-term ecological research station and site, and this is what the forest looks like before a hurricane. This is what the forest looks like after one of these severe hurricanes come through. Now, we can't always depend on hurricanes to go over our plots so that we can learn about how animals respond to hurricanes. And so what we have done is we have conducted a simulated hurricane in this forest in Puerto Rico. We call that the canopy trimming experiment. We hired professional arborists to trim the canopy of these 30 by 30 meter plots in different treatment arrays. And So the main goals of this study were first to determine the mechanisms of forest responses to the hurricanes, and then second, those main responses due to either the opening of the canopy and increase in light. Is that what drives the changes that we observe after a hurricane, or is it the debris deposition onto the forest floor? And then the second goal was to really determine the effects of increased frequency of the hurricane damage by treating these same plots every 10 years. So we've done it in 2004, and then we did it again, treated the plots in 2014, but 2.5 years after those treatments, Hurricane Irma and Maria came through and not only affected the treatment plots, but also the control plots. Here's what the forest looks like after the arborists do their trimming, much like a natural hurricane. So taking advantage of those canopy trimming plots in this wet tropical forest, how did the invasive mammals respond? And you can see here that the house mouse was not found prior to the hurricane. So in the forest understory in the years prior, we never had house mice. But after the hurricane, the canopy opens up, house mice invade into the forest interior. Secondly, the rat population did not seem to be much affected by the hurricane. They stayed mostly stable. This sampling post-hurricane occurred 9 months after the hurricane. The other aspect that we noticed again is that the grass cover abundance increased because of that opening of the canopy. And again, we think that that might be associated with this invasion of the house mice into the interior parts of the forest understory. The last point I should mention is that the canopy trimming experiment plots were really overwhelmed by these natural hurricanes, and so there were no treatment effects of small mammals from those actual experimental treatments. So conclusions, invasive wildlife can establish on new islands after hurricanes, and this has long-term consequences. It's challenging for these native and endangered species, and we often have to go in and now eradicate these invasive rats, for example, on these islands to protect the native species. The second point is that after these hurricanes, we really get species-specific responses, but consistently the house mice seem to benefit. They expand in both abundance and into the forest interior, and that's likely a short-term effect that's associated with the canopy opening. So thank you for your attention.
Hello, I am Lucille and I will talk about the effects of a hurricane on the diversity and abundance of bats in a gradient of anthropic disturbance. The frequency of Category 4 and 5 hurricanes has doubled in the last decades, and during 1951 to 2000, the frequency with which hurricanes hit the Pacific coast doubled than in the Gulf Caribbean coast. 2 hurricanes hit the Mexican Pacific coast in less than 5 years, the Hurricane Jova and Patricia. Hurricane Patricia is considered the most intense hurricane over the northeastern Pacific since 1970. Several studies reported different effects of these hurricanes. Hurricane Patricia defoliated the vegetation and collapsed trees, causing loss of canopy and biomass and sudden leaderfall, diminished the availability of flowers, fruits, and tree cavity refuge for parrots, changed avian raptor distributions, and diminished the diversity of small mammals, among other effects. Additionally, different ecosystems are exposed to different levels of disturbance, and the tropical deciduous forest is one of the most exposed to hurricanes and human disturbance. Bats are a diverse group of mammals and one of the most exposed taxa to hurricanes, representing an ideal bioindicator group. There are reports about the effects of hurricanes on bats mainly for island systems. Meanwhile, effects of hurricanes on bats in continental regions are less known. The objective of this research was to analyze the short and medium-term effects of Hurricane Patricia on the diversity of bats and the abundance of functional groups in a continental system with anthropic disturbance dominated by tropical deciduous forest. In the first part, the objective was to analyze the diversity, abundance, and body condition between pre- and post-hurricane data. And in the second part, the objective was to analyze the post-hurricane trend in species diversity, composition of species, and in the abundance of trophic gills. The fieldwork was performed in the coast of Jalisco, Mexico. We sampled bats with mist nets every 3 months from 2015 to 2017 in 3 locations, being Chamela the most conserved area and Zapata the most degraded area, and 4 habitats: tropical deciduous forest in primary and secondary succession, tropical semi-deciduous forest in primary succession, and farmlands. For the first part, we compared 18 nights in 2 pre-hurricane periods and 18 nights in 2 post-hurricane periods. For the second part, we used data from 2016 to 2017 of 3 fixed sampling stations for each location. In the first part, we analyzed species diversity metrics, changes in the rank of abundance of species, in the species composition, and the abundance of the most common species, changes in abundance of trophic gills and functional groups in accordance with 6 categorical functional traits, and changes in body condition of the most common species. For the second part, we analyzed species diversity, differences in the species composition, and variations in the abundance of trophic gills according to seasonality and post-hurricane time. We captured 990 bats of 23 species. We found significant changes in species diversity in overall, Chamela, and Zapata, but not in species richness. This indicates that changes occur in the abundance of the species or in composition more than in the number of species. It should be remembered that Chamela and Zapata were inside the hurricane eye. By habitat, we found differences in 1 metric in secondary tropical deciduous forests and in 2 metrics in farmlands, but not in species richness. Comparing locations, there were no differences before the hurricane. Meanwhile, the species diversity was lower in Zapata after the hurricane. By habitats, before the hurricane, there was a slightly higher diversity in farmlands before the hurricane. Meanwhile, it was lower in primary subdeciduous forests and in farmlands after the hurricane. Frugivorous omnivorous gill was dominant before and after the hurricane, except in Zapata, and it increased significantly in Zapata after the hurricane. Meanwhile, the abundance of nectarivorous bats decreased. Negative responses in the abundance were found in Chamela for hematophagus, insectivorous, and bats with low diet specialization, in La Fortuna for insectivorous and bats with low diet specialization, and in Zapata for the nectarivorous and bats with intermediate mobility. Positive responses were found for nectarivorous and for frugivorous omnivorous bats in Chamela and La Fortuna, and with higher diet specialization in La Fortuna, and for frugivorous and with high mobility in Zapata. By habitats, negative responses were found for understory foragers with low diet specialization and intermediate mobility in subdeciduous forests, for hematophagus and with high diet specialization in secondary deciduous forests, and for nectarivorous with intermediate diet specialization and mobility in farmlands. Positive responses were found for non-preference forages with intermediate diet specialization and low mobility in secondary deciduous forests, and for frugivorous with high diet specialization and high mobility in farmlands. Body condition did not decrease. It showed a significantly increase in Pteronotus mexicanus. It was reported that the density of insects after the Hurricane Patricia increased, which could favor the insectivorous species and increase their body condition. In the post-hurricane analysis, we found more species richness in Chamela, which was the most conserved location. However, there was a lower species diversity of orders 1 and 2. What does this mean? That the number of species was higher, but the distribution of the abundance among them had a higher dominance and therefore lower evenness. In a similar form, only in this location there were significant differences in species diversity between the 2 years after the hurricane, being higher in 2016 than in 2017. It is possible that Shamela, being the most conserved location, has functioned as a shelter area for different species in the immediate time after the hurricane. We can see that in 2016 there were more species, more rare species, and more evenness than in 2017, and the main changes occur in the abundance of the Smodus rotundus, Pteronotus mexicanus, and Artibeus lituratus. The abundance of trophic gills varied in accordance with 4 seasons previously reported for the region, being in general less abundant in the late rainy season and more abundant in the early rainy season, and in accordance with generalized lineal models only in total Hematophagus and insectivorous bats there was an effect of post-hurricane time. In the trend analysis, we found a significant post-hurricane increase in the total abundance of frugivorous, omnivorous, and insectivorous bats, and although there was a trend to decrease in nectarivorous, this trend was not significant. In conclusion, bats are good indicators of disturbance. The effects of disturbance may be identified through diversity parameters, changes in species composition, in relative abundance of the species and functional groups, and in body sizes. Greater changes were observed in sites with more disturbance, which indicates a greater vulnerability of bats in these areas. Nectarivorous bats are more vulnerable to hurricanes in the most disturbed areas. Other affected functional groups were the smallest bats with low mobility and with preference for understory and cavities. The diversity recovery was faster in the conserved area, and frugivorous, omnivorous, and insectivorous bats were benefited after the hurricane. Based on the results, it is suggested to perform analysis in other dimensions of biodiversity and on population levels, to monitor vulnerable species such as nectarivorous bats, to perform long-term research, and to conserve the natural protected areas, but also the remains of primary and secondary vegetation out of these areas. Thank you.
Alison, you have to unmute yourself. Oh, we still can hear you. I still cannot hear you. That's weird. You were talking right before. Yeah, here it shows that you're unmuted. Were you with earplugs or something during the video? No? Can you try again? It's still, yeah. This is really weird. Hi, everybody, just hang on. We're trying some tech issues here. She was talking right before. If you have any questions, please go ahead and place them in the question and answer function right at the bottom of your screens. And if the speakers want to turn on their cameras, please feel free to do so. I can try to moderate until we can hear from Allison. No. Do you want maybe get out and get in again or something? Might work. I'll keep. I see Luz. Are you there?
Hello.
Hi. Let's see if we have any questions. So far, we don't have any questions. Oh, then there's. Hi, Allison. I can see you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Wonderful.
Who knows?
Love the gods of technology. Yes. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you. I will let you take over then.
All right. So thank you to the speakers. I think the talks were really interesting, particularly for me. I think I kind of was noticing these things for myself anyway, things that I think overlapped between the three talks, between the three different mammal species, which I think is really interesting. So for people that weren't here at the beginning, I know Patricia just mentioned, but we're going to use the Q&A function. So please, any questions that you have, if you type them in there, then I'll be able to see them and I can ask them. And don't be shy. Joe, go ahead, ask away. But in the meantime, I think I'll ask a question if that's all right. And of course, if the speakers have questions, ask away as well. So my first question, not necessarily really a question, well, it sort of is, but Erin, during your talk, because the rats are invasive and you were talking about the increase of these invasive species, and in Belize, we obviously didn't study invasive animal species, but we did do ecological sampling where we found a real increase in invasive plant species, and that had a bit of an impact on the plant diversity, which then obviously had knock-on effects for the different animal species and the diversity because of the different nutrients that the invasive species provide to the primates. And I just wondered your thoughts on sort of the importance on really focusing on invasive species following disturbance to get a better handle on overall ecosystem changes, and what sort of work you think might need to be done in that space.
Hi, yeah, thanks for the question, Allison. I think it is important. Much of the really most detrimental effects of invasive species that we find are those on island systems, the continental systems, even the larger islands that are older have much more subtle effects than typically than those on more isolated islands. And so I do think it's important to keep track and understand the impacts on the suite of the potential changes in the vegetation or the animal communities, including those that are non-native or alien. But we typically find those most severe on the island system. So yeah, it's interesting that you found some of the vegetation species that kind of responded, and that's those weedy species take advantage of the high light environments. They disperse very easily. But in terms of the mammals, I would expect those changes that I was talking about to be more prevalent in the island systems for at least the invaders.
Now, the increase in grasses, are those aren't invasive? They're just
those
sort of
are
pioneer type species.
Yeah, those are native grasses. At least the ones for the most part that I can think of, that they're mostly native grasses that just heavily expand their distribution when that canopy opens up, increase in light, and the understory gets colonized by a lot more grasses. Yep.
Thank you. And Lucille, you spoke about the increase in insect population following the hurricane, which meant that the insectivorous bats increased in in size. So that's interesting to me as well, because with our monkeys, we had decrease in certain insects like wasps that had then an impact on frugivores and things. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on, you talked about the importance of diet in the bats, and that insectivorous, the ones that eat insects were increasing. But what I found interesting was the fruit eaters were increasing, but the ones that rely on nectar are decreasing. And I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that, and why there might be that difference between fruit and nectar.
Hi, Alison. I don't understand well, but the insectivorous bats possible increase their abundance, no, because insects are benefited of the humidity following the hurricane, and in general are species generalist with a broad diet. This Hurricane Patricia did not affected as well as insectivorous, nectarivorous or frugivorous. That depends more than the vegetation. Yes.
Oh, thank you. That's really good. I think that sort of highlights some of the stuff that I've been thinking about and trying to work on, which is looking at sort of the bigger ecosystem changes following these sorts of disturbance, and how important understanding those bigger system changes are. And I know that our research is often done at a species level, because that's the way that we do it, and that's, we're studying certain animals. But I just wonder if, at either of the sites that either Erin or Lucille you're working at, are there researchers working on other animals or other plants, or is your work sort of what's going on in that area?
I'll come back on here, Allison. Yeah, so I mentioned in my presentation, at least in Puerto Rico, there's a large amount of research going on to understand the effects of hurricanes on tropical forests. That's the real theme of our long-term ecological research site that has been in effect for since 1988. And there's been huge amounts of publications about the effects of natural hurricanes on various aspects of the forest ecosystem. And then more recently, like I mentioned, we have gone to the next step and tried to understand some more of the mechanistic changes by using actual experiments where we, simulate hurricane effects by hiring arborists to clip the canopy, et cetera, et cetera. So we have one special issue of Forest Ecology and Management that I alluded to it on my last slide, that looks at the first kind of mechanistic effects of hurricanes on different parameters of the forest. It could be abiotic or biotic. It's plants, both trees and understory. It's microbes, it's insects, it's snails, walking sticks, coqui frogs are the only invertebrates that are in that special issues. And just the different scientists that specialize in those areas, we're kind of all using the same experimental treatment plots to look at their various species of interests. So in terms of wildlife vertebrates, the main ones that we have in this forest, other than the invasive mammals that I talked about, which are mostly rats and mongoose, and then after large hurricanes, like I mentioned, mice. But the common ones, the really abundant ones that you see very often are frogs, the coqui frog, and lizards in the small plots. And then we do have quite a bats and birds that probably wouldn't really respond to these like patches of the 30 by 30 meter areas. But so we kind of rely on those, the responses to bats and birds. We don't have any primates that are native. There are some introduced ones in different parts of Puerto Rico. But to really understand those larger species that use kind of larger home ranges than our experimental plots, we have relied on just getting lucky and having plots or sampling before and after natural hurricanes. And yes, if you look at that website, or we can correspond in the future, and I can connect you with a lot of the research papers, because yeah, we have a whole suite of scientists from different parts of mostly the US. There are a few from the UK that have been doing work for 20 years or more in this forest to really understand the long-term effects of hurricanes on different populations of species, plants, animals, etc.
Great. Yeah, I have read that. I have read that stuff. Yeah, I just find it really interesting that in outside of some of these areas, we don't have a real understanding of the connections between, for example, in our primates, there was a real decline in figs, which really had an impact on the animals, and that decline in figs was largely due to the decline in wasps, but which we sort of came across because we're not wasp researchers. So I think that's a great example, and I think it would be really wonderful to have more sites where we can actually have all of these things going on at the same time to understand all of the impact, the knock-on impacts of wasp populations declining, and then that has this impact on this vegetation and this impact on these primates, which are seed dispersers, and then this impact on, and sort of how there's these bigger term relationships, and then that obviously has impacts for things like not hurricanes, right? So large scale logging and land clearing, and getting a better sense of how those ecosystems will respond to to more anthropogenic and non-natural disturbance. I think moving forward, particularly for primates, that's going to be, I think, really key for us to be able to better understand differential response to disturbance. So it's really great that you guys have all of that data and that long-term stuff to rely on. I think it's fabulous.
Yeah, but you're right. I mean, it's always been one of the things that is unfortunate, is that most of our understanding of tropical forests, for example, are from just a few tropical forests, right, that have been really studied well, and this is one of those. So I agree. I mean, we don't have the complete suite of species, being an island in Puerto Rico, no native primates, for example, but yeah, I agree that those kind of cross-field collaborations are really important, and that's what's been a true joy to work with that group that is in Puerto Rico, because it's just people are coming from so many different angles, and you do, as ecologists, we know that these things interact so much, that it helps to have those levels of expertise that go beyond our study species. I was going to ask you, Allison, really quickly, if you had.
Yeah, we have time.
Yeah, this was the question I wrote in the chat was that, is there any evidence of any dietary shifts in the primates, specifically towards protein or invertebrates? Because this is something that after the recent hurricanes in Puerto Rico, in studying rats, these invasive rats, I also do a lot of assessments of diet, and also types of, they're largely frugivores, and so kind of before the hurricane, they readily remove fruits from the forest floor, and then after the hurricane, they're kind of like missing? I mean, we know that they're there because we sample them, but you put out fruits on the forest floor. Well, one, it's very hard to find fruits that are available, you know, in the year after a hurricane. And then when you do, they just seem not to be keyed in on them. Maybe they can't find them, or what I'm thinking is that maybe there's a whole kind of explosion typically of different types of insects after these opening up of the canopy, stimulation, higher light, more insects of certain species, that they might switch their diet. And I've kind of started to look into this, but it made me think about it with your study, actually both yours and Lou's study, to look at maybe did the primates actually, you know, being frugivorous, do they take advantage of, you know, invertebrates, and does that show up after the hurricane when they're kind of more desperate?
Really good question. I'll answer quickly for mine, and then Lou, I'll let you answer, talk about the bats. We did see a shift in diet, but not toward insects. So howler monkeys rarely ingest insects, so, well, on purpose. So we did see there was no fruit that was produced for about 18 months. So they didn't eat any fruit. So what we saw was a real shift in mature leaves, which are historically thought to be a real low quality food item. But one of the invasive plants that was growing, Cecropia peltata, they were eating that a lot. And when we did analysis of the leaves, it actually had quite a bit of protein, but what it actually had was quite a bit of sugar. And so it was an interesting possible way to try and nutrient balance in the lack of having fruits available. They were ingesting leaves that were higher in sugar, and therefore we would assume would taste a little bit sweeter. Not that we've eaten them. I did have a reviewer once asked if I ate them. I said, no, I don't actually know if they taste sweeter, but what we think, but Cecropia peltata are also a myrmecophyte, right? So they've got this relationship with ants. So I think inadvertently they were eating, probably, I don't think they could have not been ingesting ants, because they're just, these trees are just swarmed with them. So I do think that they probably had an increase in protein through insects, but it wasn't intentional from our perspective. But again, we didn't have anybody assessing changes in insect abundance. Whereas obviously at Lou's site, Lou, you spoke about the increase in insect abundance. So were you able to note any differences in the diet of the bats, or was it just more of a monitoring? But yeah, do you have an understanding about how the diet of the bats changed after the hurricane? So what they ate?
If I understand about changes in the diet, there I don't. There are no reports in the area. Yes, also, there are no reports about changes in the diet of insectivorous bats. Yes.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Again, highlighting the way different animal researchers do different research, right? So we can't trap our monkeys, so we're doing counts, which isn't as accurate as what you're doing with bats, which I think is really fabulous that you're getting this real accurate measure by diet type. So it's again just really, I find it really interesting to look at the different methods used across. We do have a few minutes left. I don't see any questions on the Q&A, and I, for some reason, can't see the chat. There it is. So are there any other questions that anybody has, or any comments that anybody wants to make? No, well then I will end off the session just by thanking the researchers again. I think that it was really interesting for me to hear a little bit more about the work, and to start thinking about the different methods that different researchers are using, and the the different links between, as I was saying, the different invasive and native species and all the ecosystem chain, and how all of that is disrupted in a different way by the hurricane. And it's not always bad, right? As a primate researcher, I always write about destruction. But if you're an invasive rat, that's, gives you, it's not disruptive for you. It's not destructive for you. It actually allows you to flourish. And so I think those different perspectives are quite interesting, quite important to take on board. And I would love to talk to both Lou and Aaron more a little bit about the different connections between the animals and sort of future directions of this research as hurricanes become more prevalent, and we sort of becomes more important that we understand quickly which animals are going to do well and which animals are not, and what impacts that will have on greater ecosystem viability into the future. So if no one else has any comments, I will thank everybody so much for coming. Have a fabulous rest of your day. And I look forward to seeing some of you virtually in some of the other sessions through the week. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Allison.
Thank you.